Good morning and welcome to the final in this Australian College of Applied Psychology's Get Equipped speaker series. I'd like to start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm Catherine Fox, your moderator for this morning. So this is the fourth in a series of talks and we've been holding them over the last few weeks in Sydney. And they've all been revolving around the idea of mental health, the skills that you need during this incredibly tense time that we've all been living through. We've been looking at, I suppose, what's called soft skills, those kinds of empathy, emotional control and so on, and how important they are for all of us and particularly for leaders. We've also looked at things such as the concept of being an accidental counsellor in your workplace and what that entails. And the power of being your authentic self, what that actually means. It can sound a little puzzling, I think. The link between neuroscience and training your brain, which indeed I think we all know is possible to do. Last week, in fact, we welcomed the college's CEO, George, who provided some insights into how the college actually pivoted during the pandemic and the strategy behind that. And we also chatted to Tim about future-proofing our careers and organisations during what's now called the fourth industrial revolution, along with the importance of that whole area of value alignment, which I think links in very much to authenticity. Today we're going to end the series by looking at the strength of being the change that you want to be, and we've got two wonderful speakers here this morning to share some thoughts with us. The college's B. Pennell is going to chat to us about something called sustainable leadership, but moving well beyond perhaps the traditional idea of it being an environmental issue, although I suppose in its broader sense we are talking about our own mental environments. And our special guest is Charlotte Connell from the Sustainability Collective and Fishburner's Sustainability Lead. And she's going to talk about making changes from within and the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN, both for your business and for you as a leader, and what that actually means. What are we talking about when we talk about leaders and leadership? Now, the college created this series very much as a way of giving back to its audience, to people who are working throughout various areas and need to think about those tools. And it's been a fascinating experience and a real circuit breaker, I think, for us to reflect on some of the pressures over the last year, and certainly very enlightening. And I think we've all gone away from each of these talks thinking slightly differently about how we cope and manage and move forward. Now, I'm going to start this morning by handing over to B. B is the college's Associate Professor, Counselling and Coaching, and she's going to be telling us a little bit more about sustainable leadership. B.
Great, thanks Catherine, and really good to be here. Hi Charlotte. So I wanted to also start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are now. Currently I'm on Gadigal land, and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and also welcome all of you here today. I think we're going to have a really great conversation around sustainability, what that means in our practice. We want to get really practical because I think ultimately to be an effective leader and to be an effective sustainable leader, one is understanding what that is, and two is understanding, well, how do I actually apply that? So I'll make sure that we cover both of those points as we go along. So in terms of the idea of sustainable leadership, it's been around for quite a while, but I think in particular now, going through such challenging times with COVID, of course, in particular, that it's really difficult, I think, to for us to sort of sometimes take that bigger picture perspective. And that's the thing that I wanted to really address here today, is that during times of challenge, where we've got a lot on our plate, where we've got, homeschooling, as well as working from home, as well as everything else, not being able to see loved ones, and, the list goes on. What actually happens, we know from the way that our brain works, is that our vision narrows. We often get very much thinking about things in the short term, and we often actually get quite selfish. This is if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when we're going back down to that sort of bottom survival kind of place. And so sustainable leadership is actually very difficult to switch on in our awareness during times of high stress, and I think also during times of COVID. So I wanted to give you some ideas as to basically how we can think about this and then how we can apply that. So what happens under stress is that we've probably all been in these situations in a crisis. Our brain naturally will focus in on what's most important in that moment. And actually one of the key things is what our brain and our whole nervous system does is we go into defence. We defend ourselves against some kind of threat. Now, I would suggest right at the outset of this conversation, and I'd be really interested in us having a dialogue around this, is that actually sustainability, a sustainable mindset, is the opposite of defence. It's actually being open. It's actually about thinking long term. It's actually about thinking about people other than us. And so there's this tension because we're in a situation of stress. Our brains just do their survival thing, but we're also trying to cultivate this sustainable leadership mindset. And so I wanted to sort of talk about how we can move around that tension. So really just want to get to the definition. Well, what is sustainable leadership? And I think firstly I wanted to start by defining leadership. And what I would say is that anyone, of course, can be a leader. That leadership is not based on rank. It's certainly not based on position. And we've seen some really awesome people. Greta Thunberg is a simple example, or a powerful example even, of someone who just steps up and takes a leadership role regardless of any job description and so on. And so my definition of leadership is a leader has the ability to have a vision and to bring that into action. And pretty much the way that a leader brings that into action is through influencing and working with others. So there's very much a quality of leadership that I think involves our ability to have high levels of ability to influence, to persuade maybe, collaboration, and all of these require a certain, Catherine mentioned, a soft skill set of emotional intelligence and so on, that I think is a really important part for us to consider when we're looking at what is now sustainable leadership. The way that I would define that is a leader that thinks more long-term, ultimately thinking about future generations, but also a leader that has the ability to see things from multiple perspectives, not just from our own, and that a leader that has the ability to collaborate and work with others, taking into account, of course, the UN Sustainable Goals, which Charlotte is going to talk about, and looking at how we can move towards one of those 17 goals in our day-to-day roles, which is a tough ask, but Charlotte has got some really great ways that we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. The other thing, of course, in businesses is that having a corporate social responsibility of leaders to be aware not just about the business but also about kind of the wider impact of decision making. And so what I would say in summary, a definition of sustainable leadership is someone that makes decisions thinking about not only shareholders but stakeholders. And when I mean stakeholders, it's not just the customers, not just the environment, and not just maybe the future generations, but actually is able to think about all of those things together. So one of the things that defines, again, sustainable leadership is that we change, it's a little bit of a clumsy word, but I wanted to use it deliberately, we become less anthropomorphic, which is a mouthful, but what it means is we actually no longer just think about us as humans and all of our social relationships, but we actually think about the plants, animals, rocks, stones, rivers and so on, and the environment. And there's also an element in there which we won't be able to go into in terms of thinking about the impact of technology on our the way that we work through sustainability issues. So sustainable leadership thinks about not just shareholders but stakeholders, and the stakeholders are more than just human stakeholders. All right, so we've got that definition hopefully in some kind of understanding, but now I want to kind of narrow it down a little bit more as to what are the actual elements that make up sustainable leadership. And the main point that I want to make here is that I think as a leader that really focuses on sustainability, it's a mindset shift. It's that shift from the default that our brain goes into in terms of survival and defence and, you know, competition and it's us against the world, to a mindset shift of how else might I think about this? What are the long-term implications of my decision? Who else is impacted as a result of my decision? The other piece to do with the element of sustainable leadership is good old emotional intelligence. We've heard it so much bandied around, this term of EQ, but I would suggest that our ability to move from, say, a shareholder mindset to a stakeholder level of engagement requires quite a sophisticated level of people skills. And it's something that in the executive coaching work that I do is often will come up, where someone has been promoted into a leadership position, but they don't actually have the people skills to engage in these kind of dialogues, to address conflict and difference of opinion, and people having completely different values or agendas, and how we actually resolve that. So being able to develop emotional intelligence, I think, is a really key element. And that when we're able to move from discussion and debate into dialogue, one of the really key factors, I think, and it's an overused term, but is the ability to listen. And the way that now the research shows us is that what makes a really effective listener is the ability to actually put our own agenda aside and to have much more of a curious mindset. Wonder what's going on here. I wonder why this person has this particular agenda. I wonder how this person is seeing this particular issue, and can I get into their shoes so I can understand the issue a bit more. So that emotional intelligence piece is the ability to really deeply listen, and that helps us to shift into my next point, which is moving from me focus to a we focus. And the we focus, of course, is people coming together in dialogue, perhaps even ideally collaborating, consulting, and maybe even if we need to, debating, but that our mindset shifts much more from the defend that we talked about at the beginning to people, the simple metaphor, the way I describe it, is people coming together in a circle. The reason why I say circle, it's also learning from our Indigenous elders, is the ability to sit in circle actually takes away hierarchy, it takes away rank. Ideally, I think it's multi-generations of people of all diverse backgrounds coming together in circles to have these discussions, but ultimately to have dialogue, moving into that, slowing the conversation down and really listening and understanding another person's mindset. The other piece to this is what we call systems thinking, which is actually ultimately to realise that everything is interconnected, that everything that we do is interconnected. It's like we're living in this vast spider web, and if something gets pulled and moves in one area, we've seen in the media and in the world, there's this ripple effect that goes. So how do we actually make sense of this fact that everything's interconnected? We now know there's a really simple way that we can kind of navigate that. And it's unfortunate that the terminology has been overwritten by our use of Zoom, but I do think the term of the idea of zooming in and zooming out is a really simple way to think about this ability to have a systems way of thinking. So what I mean by that is most of the time in our thinking we zoom in, we look at the detail, and we kind of forget to zoom out and look at the big picture. So the way to develop more of a sustainable mindset is to have those moments, I also call them helicopter moments, where we're looking up from a bigger picture and zooming out and seeing the longer term perspective. There's of course lots of other elements that make up sustainable leadership, but I wanted to kind of sit with those main points. And just to finish off around just this kind of main question as to how do leaders actually pivot to a sustainable mindset? And the first thing that I would say is that the key is actually to be aware of our stress levels, because as soon as we're in stress, our brains go into defence. We forget all of our emotional intelligence. We've all done that, haven't we, me included? And we forget to listen. We're pushing our own agenda. Sustainability's gone out of the window. So that stress regulation, I think, is really important, particularly during COVID. And then moving into those collaborative dialogues, taking the systems view, zooming in and zooming out. So I'll just finish with a really simple example. I was working with a CEO who was of a startup company, and basically when COVID came along, their whole market kind of fell out from underneath them. Their profit margin was slashed, and she had about 30 staff and found herself super stressed and going into what we call command and control. She was basically becoming very directive, very pushy, and all of her staff were starting to hate her. They were getting really resistant, rebellious, and so on. And so in having some coaching conversations with her, one was she realised her stress levels, and we worked with her as to how she could just take some time out and calm down. And then we looked at how she could actually move into more of a dialogue. And so she created these circles with her team. They sat together. It took a while. They did 3 different sessions over a number of weeks where everyone got a chance to speak, to share. At times they were kind of venting and complaining. But once they moved through that kind of resentment, they're able to come back to their original purpose and actually talk about what's important. And as a result of those conversations, there were people in that meeting that came up with completely novel ways of how the company could show up in their particular industry. They had much more of a focus on providing a greater value add to their customers, much more focused on building relationships with their customers. They were all super inspired as a result of this. It really shifted their mindset, and as a result, they've pivoted in the way that the services that they're offering and looking much more at the impact, as we said, on the stakeholders and not just the shareholders. So happy to go into that in more detail when we're going through some questions, but that's basically a brief summary of what I would describe as sustainable leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Bea. That was fascinating. It did make me also think that having written for years about emotional intelligence, I think it's time we started to be a bit more specific about what that means, because I think in business circles for a long time it was meant you were nicer, you were somehow kinder. Nothing wrong with being kinder, by the way, but it was almost seen as sort of weakness, and I think realigning so that we reinforce and reward emotional intelligence, which is, as you say, quite a complex thing to master. So fascinating insights. I should have said at the beginning, by the way, that we're very happy to take questions after Charlotte has spoken, and if anyone is watching online and would like to send a question through, please do. We'd love to hear from you. But now I'd like to hand over to Charlotte.
Wonderful. That was so insightful. Thank you so much, Bea. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which we meet, the Gadigal people, and as well as the Awabakal people from where I grew up. So I'd like to acknowledge their leaders past, present and emerging. So I'd also like to start with a story that illustrates basically what Bea was talking about, that anybody can be a leader. And it's a story about my grandma. In the 1930s, the Labor Party branch meetings didn't allow women to vote at their branch meetings. Women were given the vote in 1902, but they weren't allowed to in these party rooms. Now, as a 15-year-old, I would have been very disengaged in politics, disenfranchised, and thought, you know what, screw this, I don't like politics, no way you can impact change. But my grandma, as a 15-year-old in 1938, joined the Labor Party because she could see an opportunity to change that from within. In 1974, the housewife and mum of 4 became Australia's first female Lord Mayor. She did quite a number of pioneering things, and one of them was, under her leadership, Newcastle City Council was the first council in Australia to fly the Aboriginal flag. It was symbolic. She didn't have support of the council at the time or any of the other councillors, anyone in management, but she knew it was the right thing to do. So she got the media along and they couldn't say no then. But I wanted to tell that story because it illustrates, oh, excuse me, I think I did have too much coffee. It illustrates that anyone can be a leader, but also importantly, if you don't agree with something and you don't see it as right, don't run away from it. You can actually change it and it's much more powerful. It took me a while to learn that lesson. Inspired by my grandma, I actually left my job and my security of home and went and volunteered on a remote island because I wanted to change the world for the better. I learned a language, I made some friends, but I really didn't have much of an impact. I mean, it's such a funny mentality to think that you can go into a foreign country and save them. Like, how ridiculous. But it was a really great learning experience. But what I found is, back in Sydney, in an office, I had so much more of a positive impact, creating change for people, planet, and a prosperous future in that office, working with Woolies, Coles, John West, working with the big companies they were often seen as the bad guys. So I hope that those little stories inspire you, and I hope they're the takeaways today. If you can read the screen, I am on a mission to democratise sustainability. Having worked in the NGO and NFP sector for a long time, it really did feel like doing good only belonged to that sector, no one else. And I really wanted to demystify that. So I'll talk about the evolution of this from profit to purpose, the benefits of investing in sustainability, and most importantly, how to get started. So B talked about this in terms of the fundamental shift from me to we. And I can see that clearly in the shift from old power to new power. And what I mean by that is old power is like a currency. It's owned and it's jealously hoarded. A few have it and they don't share it. And it comes with title and status and lineage. New power is like a current. You don't own it, you channel it. It's open, it's participatory, and it's for everyone to share. It's collaborative. Old power, competitive; new power, collaborative. And I think the two best examples of that are old power, Donald Trump; new power, Greta Thunberg. She doesn't own that power, she shares it. Her power is in the participation. It's in the purpose. And she doesn't own that. She's just channeling it. We also see this in consumer behaviour and how we buy things. A recent study just came out that 4 out of 5 Australians, we look for brands that stand for a stronger purpose, that act on climate change, that act on plastic pollution, that don't just sell me something, but support the ideals we believe in. And similarly, we see the price that companies and brands pay when they don't stand for something. And we can see this in cancel culture. I won't even mention his name, but we know of someone who was a pizza chef, became a guru in health apparently, who promoted hate speech, and very well, all the brands that did support him dropped him, even took the products off the shelves, because they don't want to be selling his ideals. So the benefit, it can also become your secret weapon. If you stand for a purpose more so than just selling something, this can be your secret weapon, even not even secret, that's just your weapon out there. And I think the key thing here is, I've got not the best eyesight, but the stat on the screen there is 91% of global consumers will choose a brand that's for purpose over one that's not. But it has to have similar quality and price. Today, everybody registered for this event through Humanitics. And it was pretty simple, right? It's pretty much exactly the same as the other event ticketing platforms. Humanitics has spent a lot of time and resources into making sure that their product is just the same as any other out there. But the difference is Humanitics supports educational programs in developing countries, supports educational programs in Australia. So of course you're going to choose Humanitics. It has a stronger purpose. It has a benefit that's beyond just what you're purchasing. It's not just transactional. So that's a really great example. You need to be solving a customer problem first, not just for purpose. It needs to also be of quality. There will be some people who pay a bit higher or will compromise quality, but let's not make them choose sustainability or quality. It should be both. The other one is it engages your team, your workforce. Particularly Gen Y and Gen Z are practically completely disengaged in workforces unless they can derive meaning from where they are, the purpose behind it. So this can also be a secret weapon for you to work on. And actually 71% of employees look for CSR before joining a new workplace. So it's really important to have that clearly communicated. And I think we were talking about leaders before in terms of business. 91% of CEOs, this is from a World Economic Forum study, that 91% of CEOs believe sustainability is critical to success, but only 48% are doing anything about it. So we know it's important, but they have to do it. I'm going ahead of myself. And the third benefit is you actually do make more profit when you focus on your purpose. So some examples are Unilever, a huge company. Half of their top 40 brands are their sustainable living brands, and they derive 60% of the company's growth and grow 50% faster than the rest of their brands. Qantas hit their highest share price mark when they announced their carbon neutrality plan, which they're probably ahead of schedule at the moment for. Ben & Jerry's grew 26% last quarter during COVID, when most companies were not doing as well, and during their climate action campaign. And Patagonia is $1 billion powerhouse. It's iconic in the sustainability circles. They spend very little on advertising, and when they do, it's not about a product, it's not about a sale, it's about a purpose, it's about a campaign for people and for planet. So I'm sure you're all really inspired and you want to get started. So how do we get started? The first thing you do is, what does good look like? So what is sustainability? You can call it out if you like. Has anyone got any? I mean, you'll all be right. There's only right answers, so don't worry. Matt?
I think it's that the ability to create a system
That's absolutely correct. So Matt was talking about, making sure that what you take is also equal to what you give back. So it's sustainable. That is correct. Sometimes people who want to get into sustainability come to me and they say, I want to organise a beach cleanup, which is fantastic. And it's contributing to the health of the oceans and the beach. There are many things sustainability encompasses, and it could take a long time to define this within your teams or within your own sphere of influence. But someone else has already done it. In fact, 193 nations came together to do this. And I find these 17 goals, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the best global framework for looking at what sustainability is. It's not just about planting trees, climate action. It's not just about people. It's about all of these things. Now, these Sustainable Development Goals were created in 2015, and they replaced the Millennium Development Goals, if anyone has heard of those before. So the Millennium Development Goals, I do know because I was working on them in the volunteer program. It was very much about, hey, developing countries, if we give you aid to work on these goals, we'll all be better off. What I love about the Sustainable Development Goals, everybody is accountable, and they're all intrinsically linked. You can't achieve one goal without the other. You can't achieve gender equality without reducing inequalities all around. So I love these goals so much. And I use these if you want to implement sustainability, look at these goals. Now, what was number 3? Anyone? Totally okay. 17. I mean, who can even remember a 10-digit number these days? There's 17 goals. I can't think, it would be really hard to reduce them. They're all very important. But number 3, I think, is really important, because without good health and well-being, we won't be able to achieve those things. We have to look after ourselves first before we can actually motivate this. So it's like that sustainability mindset. So don't worry. I've been looking at these goals. I love these goals, and I still can't recite all 17 of them. I tried to dress as my favourite goal today, which was 14, life below water, but I think I look more like 6, but doesn't matter. So I'd like everyone now to not just try to memorise 17 goals, because that's really hard, and I'm not going to test you on it, but maybe turn to the person next to you or write down on your notepad and think about 1 or even 3 goals that really speak to you, that call out to you, that you are passionate about, and that you know you can implement change with. So which ones align intrinsically to your values? Lisa, that's more than 3. Oh, you're reading them. Oh, that's okay. That's totally fine. All of them, all of them. You're absolutely right. They are equally as important. So it's really just to maybe just mind shift. I always have 3. I like gender equality. Maybe I'm a woman and I really care about that issue. I love 17 because partnerships for the goals is really important. This isn't something you can do alone, and that's about that new power. It's through collaboration that we can achieve this. So 17 is always a favourite of mine. 5, and because I love the ocean, it's 14 as well for me. But 13, climate action. If we don't take care of our climate, then, you know, our oceans aren't great. We don't have food security, or we have more inequalities. So they are all really linked. You can't just ignore one. But by achieving one, it helps the others. It lifts the others up. So now we can agree on what sustainability looks like and what good, great, fantastic looks like. Now, 2020 was a year. It was out there. It was also the start of the decade of action. We are meant to reach these goals by 2030. So 2015 to 2020 was about raising awareness. 2020 was let's get to action. Great year to start something new, isn't it? 2020. Now, implementing these goals, I want you to focus on the 1 to 3 that you really are passionate about right now. And the easiest way, I think, that you can implement these into your work is through a theory of change logic model. I didn't create this. This is something that's been around in the social enterprise space for quite a while. So it's really just about thinking about the impacts you want to make, the goals you want to make, and working backwards to what activities, what outcomes, what outputs go in there. And you can even slim this down to just activities, outcomes, and impact. So just a really quick example, because I know I'm cognizant of time, but impact could be, I'll go with SDG 5. So we want to impact gender equality. So an activity could be, well, I'll put the input would be a policy, and it's something that I have implemented. I worked in infrastructure sustainability, and in construction, 3% of the workforce are female. But we implemented a policy to make sure that all of our speakers for events would have 50-50 representation with female and male. So that was our policy. Our activity is to research the best speakers in this. It's not just simply whacking a woman on stage because of her gender. The output was we achieved 50% ratio. The outcome is there's more female leaders seen. It creates pathways for more women to lead. And the impact is SDG 5. So that's very, very simplified. And I'm just going through for that purpose. So the takeaways, I wanted to end on another story. In 2012, John West, we all know John West. Half of you would have a John West tuna can in your cupboard because they have 43% of the market share in Australia. In 2012, Greenpeace launched a huge campaign globally against John West for their destructive fishing methods. They threw red paint at their headquarters in Melbourne, and staff there were ashamed to work there for the first time. I worked for a sustainable seafood eco-label, and we started working with them to revolutionise their supply chain, to work with the fisheries that they source their tuna from, to make them more sustainable, certified to the global best practice. In 2016, they became the brand that had more sustainable offerings of tuna than any other brand globally. And in 2016, they won the Banksia Award, which is Australia's premier sustainability awards in business, the Gold Award, which is their top award. And they beat Patagonia. Not that I'm competitive, and now they have that beautiful award displayed in those same headquarters that was splashed with red paint only 4 years earlier. So back to my story about my grandma, if you don't agree with something or if you don't think you're doing sustainability well right now, you can, and you can implement change. We have a tendency to like to talk to people who have similar minds to ourselves. We have similar opinions on things, and you create an echo chamber and you don't learn from that, and you can't really impact more change. So if you don't like someone's opinion or if you don't agree with something, don't run away from it and see how you can implement some positive change. So thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And such a lovely segue between you, I think, the idea of applying those principles of sustainability to leadership, that leadership can be dispersed. It's not about being at the top of the pile, as it were, the job title. But Charlotte, a terrific link too with having those goals around what you do, what the impact of what you do and what you're part of. And we might move on to maybe even talking about that in a self-employed area as well, which I think is of interest. Do we have any questions at this stage from our audience? Yes, we do. We have one.
Absolutely. So the question was about super. It's wonderful because it's where a lot of Australians or a lot of us have the most amount to invest, to make a change. And it's such a simple step. It's so easy. There's a few, I won't, I'm not sponsored by any, so I won't say which one, but it was incredibly easy. You just make a phone call and you just switch it over. And there's been a switch about 3% of Australians. It doesn't seem like much, but it's enough to make the rest of the super industry say, we should get better about this. We should get better about reporting this. So it's really important. And you can see that now. BlackRock, the largest investor in the world, has said we are making sustainability our new standard. So, you can step up and lead now, and that's a really great and simple step, and it doesn't affect anything you do during the day. And the returns are really just as good as the other super I was in. Not very good at sticking to my script, but I was going to talk about the fact that we're already, and before COVID, we're in an era of radical visibility. Greenwashing just isn't as easy as it used to be. And I know that I'm working with companies who are scared to come out and say, we're going to do this because, then they have to be held accountable. But it is good to make announcements about where you want to go, but you really need to back that up, and consumers will hold you to account. So I don't think companies just can't greenwash anymore. We're all too aware to let them. But definitely, I know I've worked with big companies, which I won't name, who made some really ambitious statements and were like, and 5 years later, they didn't reach their goals. But you know what? Even making those statements made their competition step up. So, and my point was, perfect is the enemy of good. You might not be perfect at it, but you learn by doing. So get started on that journey. Just make your peers aware of the goals, or just start implementing some small changes. This is a journey. We've got till 2030.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting if you look at the other side of the spectrum with a lot of the radicalism that's happening in America, where there's a lot of people that feel like they are right and they are stepping up and being leaders in whatever they believe in because they want to make their voice heard. And I think it's just really interesting, two experiences to compare where last Friday I was having a conversation and we both thought that we were right, and therefore we did narrow down and sharpen our focus, versus this morning. It wasn't very serious, but a guy hit me in his car while I was on my bike and knocked me off. And it was just amazing. He was, because he knew he was in the wrong, he was so apologetic, he was so open.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So basically this guy that knocked me off my car, he was so apologetic and open and doing all of those things that you spoke about. And I just thought it was very interesting how as leaders, you want to be confident in being right and know that you've got that knowledge. But then on the other hand, that mindset that we want to adopt is often what we adopt when we're wrong. And I just wanted to get some input as to how you balance that openness with certainty, because it's really hard to do both of those things, particularly in the heat of the moment when you're stressed and when you're under pressure.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it links into what I mentioned earlier about, in those moments of high stress, we do tend to go into defence, and maybe even that person's insurance broker would have told them, don't admit that you're wrong, and so that we've been trained actually to defend and to push back, and I was right and you were wrong, and I do think there is a place for that, for standing up and going, hey, this is not okay, this is not right. So I'm not suggesting that we all kind of become like, a Mary Poppins sort of approach, but I think the really key to unlocking this is the word curiosity of like, what actually might be happening here, or what else is happening, or tell me more. That question. One of my mentors, that was one of his key ways of working with people. Just tell me more so I can understand more. Sometimes it's not appropriate. Other times it really is. And I think we look at people that are in opposition, the massive opposition, as you say, in America between the left and the right. I think that the only way we're really going to be able to resolve that is to start to move into dialogue. Maybe we're not ready in political environments, but maybe in smaller situations, in our communities, in our workplaces, even in our families, that we can start small, and then there's the ripple effect.
And just on that curiosity, I guess linked to that is I find a lot of people, I think as there's more information and confusion, prefacing a statement with, I might be wrong, but, and then expressing an opinion that they hold really, really strongly.
Yes.
And I find that very difficult because it's like, you are wrong.
Yeah.
So we don't need to have the second statement that came after that climate change isn't real or whatever other thing that they're talking about.
It's quite passive-aggressive, that kind of thing, isn't it? It's sometimes you hear somebody apologising almost. They're not actually apologising.
Yes.
Sorry, not sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think on that, one of the things someone taught me years ago, and this is in a gender context, because the dynamics often in a heated conversation between men and women can be, very difficult. And a woman was saying to me she'd been bailed up at the school gate because her daughter had had a haircut, get this. And one of the other mums said, gosh, your daughter's hair is very short. And she thought, right, what do I now? So this is clearly, this woman's affronted. And she said, I just asked another question. I said, oh, why do you say that? What are you talking about? And she said, sometimes asking another question, which actually can be a little faux, it's not real, but actually it is about curiosity. Tell me what you're thinking. Can I tell you the number of times, as somebody who works in the gender space, how many times I've been told, women, you have to be a woman these days to get a job, to get a promotion, to get on a board, which is completely untrue. So I always say, oh, that's interesting. Where did you get your information from? What are you basing it on? And I'm being slightly passive-aggressive, I must admit, but I actually do want to know. And, you'd be surprised, and you keep asking a question. Tell me a little bit more about that. Where did you get that information from? How did you form that opinion? And in fact, it can actually, you can land in a place that's more constructive, is my feeling.
Yeah, I think it's really that sense of moving from debate into dialogue. And the way that we move into dialogue is by asking questions. And it's a skill, I think, that it takes a while to get used to, and having a few good one-liners sort of memorised can be helpful in the heat of the moment. But to turn our conversations into asking more questions than spouting our opinions is, I think, a really important part. And linked into what you were saying just a few minutes ago around the difference between, say, a fixed mindset, tell me how I'm wrong, but, compared to a growth mindset, how can I see this differently? And we've got now some really great research that shows that even teaching children a growth mindset opens up possibility for different ways of thinking, for learning, and for relating. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, there's a bit of a conundrum at the heart of some of the issues that we've talked about this morning, and it's to do, in fact, with transparency and visibility. Social media, we've already talked about some of the things that have gone on in the US. So there's a dark side to social media. On the other hand, it has made organisations much more accountable for when they say, okay, we are concerned about gender equity, or we're concerned about pollution and so on. they can actually be judged on their actions in a much more tangible way. Glassdoor and other sites, obviously, you can actually look at what an employer is like from people who've worked there. This is a bit of an interesting sort of mix, isn't it? What are the pluses and minuses of the whole social media area in this kind of area? Maybe, Charlotte, starting with you on the sustainability front.
Wow, it's such an interesting time now because with Facebook no longer being able to post media, traditional media.
Well, they are now. They've come back.
They've come back. Okay, it was great because for a while there was just Batuta Advocate, which is my favourite source of news. There are obviously pluses and minuses. I did touch on that cancel culture, but then things can be taken widely out of context and spread like wildfire. And if it bleeds, it leads in the wrong ways. I do think it's better in terms of that radical visibility and that transparency. You just can't get away with doing the bad stuff anymore. So that is a real strong positive. And I can't help but think of the erosion of media across the Australian landscape, which you can talk to more, Catherine, but I read an incredible essay in the Monthly just recently about the freedom of information. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here, but I think if media are denied access, or if 70% of our media landscape is owned by one conglomerate, there is a place for social media to step up, but there is... When we're talking about the opinions of people, it needs to be backed up with real facts. And that fifth estate is disappearing and disintegrating in terms of what's in social media. The currency is popularity. It might not be right, but it's popular. So if you look on, the most powerful person on the world would be Kim Kardashian. Doesn't make her perfect and right and the perfect leader we need. So there is social media is good to hold people accountable, but the currency of popularity isn't always the best one.
And B, do you think, in fact, that the impact of social media and access to an enormous amount of information, has that in some ways, funnily enough, compromised our ability to do the deep listening? To stand in someone else's shoes? I know it sounds contradictory, but I wonder...
I think it's a really good point in that there's so many voices that are out there, and then so much reactivity. I've made a little bit of a habit of mine. If someone posts something really controversial, I go in and look at how people respond, whether it's on YouTube or Instagram or elsewhere. And what I find, it actually gives me a lot of hope, is that the trolls, the people that are much more aggressive, they are the ones that are getting talked down, and they're the ones that are saying this is not okay, and the voices of, you could say, the masses, the voices of us, is much more and growing more and more positive. It's about acknowledging diversity, it's about understanding other people, it's about standing up for what's right and what's important. So the more that I start to look not just at the headline of social media, but the granular conversations or the responses that happen in response to some of these maybe even controversial posts, I get more and more optimistic, actually, because I'm seeing there is a lot of people out there that are caring, and there's a lot of people out there now that have a platform and a voice, and we're all learning how to use that voice. I think it's almost like a skill that we haven't quite mastered yet. How do we use the fact that I don't know the percentage, but the proportion of people globally that have access to a mobile phone is actually incredibly high. So we've now got the ability to hear what's going on from all parts of the world. Then there's now the process of how do we digest that information and make sense of it. But ultimately, I do think that the overall message is one of hope, and that, dare I say it, that I think ultimately humans are good, and that we're trying all to do our best with the challenges that we're faced.
Yeah, it's a very optimistic take. But I would have to say, having watched the whole corporate social responsibility space for a long time, I think it has moved in a very positive direction, from ethical investment right through to reputation. It is about reputation, but it has an impact now, and that's great.
And just one point about that, which I think we're all alluding to, but I wanted to really highlight, is we know now the research shows that we actually feel better when we do good. And particularly we feel better when we do good for others. more and more I'm finding in the work, and we had a conversation just earlier this morning, in that the work that I'm doing with people is they get to the stage where they're kind of sick of focusing on themselves, and they're thinking, how can I contribute? How can I give back? What is it that I can do for my community, my local school, my local surf club, or whatever it might be? And actually we know more and more from the research, that's what makes us feel good. This whole focus on well-being and resilience and so on, it's no longer about the individual and our own kind of narcissism, it's about contribution and giving back. And I'm seeing that in social media as well.
Which is fantastic to hear. Just to sort of wrap up, one of the things I did want to ask you, and I mentioned before, if you work for yourself, this may be a little close to home for me, or you're in a small business, how do you apply some of what we've been hearing, in fact, from both of you this morning? So how do we look at the whole area of sustainable leadership, and also as our own business, how can we contribute to that and make sure that, you know, we're implanting some of those principles? So maybe Charlotte, if you could kick us off.
Sure. Super is a great one to start with, which we already crossed on. But I'm wearing a little green pin for the Climate Reality Leadership Program and the SDG goals right here, the rainbow one. But now the Climate Reality Program, which Al Gore runs, is you can be a leader from where you're standing right now. You don't need to change your career. You don't need to change the opinions of climate deniers. There's some people you will never change the opinion of. But just start implementing changes from where you are. So as a small, very small sole trader, like, what can I do? I'll have a gender or a diversity and inclusion policy in my hiring I do ad hoc projects. So you can, just recently I was thinking, I try not to consume very much, but during Christmas, I make sure that the gifts I give, the physical ones, have a positive outcome, have a positive impact. So I try to buy from social enterprises, even just who caters for your events. Supply Nation is a fantastic directory of certified Indigenous businesses. So if you need a graphic designer, you could go there, or photographer, or anything that you need. So that's a really great one that I see I can use. So in terms of your suppliers, your procurement, but also in the conversations you're having. So you don't really need to change your sphere of influence much, you just use it.
That's a great point. And Bea?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Charlotte. And the last point that I would say is around those conversations, the one takeaway that I try and sit with as much as possible is a curious mindset. I really think that sustainability, sustainable leadership really comes down to that curious mindset, because it shifts our perspective from that defence, from our own selfishness, to look at the bigger picture, to look at what's going on from another perspective. And it really helps for us to ask different questions about the problems before we try and jump in and find the solutions. So curious mindset.
Curious. Well, as a journalist, I need no convincing of the curious mindset, but I do actually often, especially these days, I really appreciate the training I had around that, and not to take things at face value. What's behind that? Tell me a little bit more about that, and so on. Thank you both so much. So illuminating and uplifting. And such a great way for us to end, I think, this series. We've had so much on the macro, but also the micro that we can apply to the way we go about our work and pursue our careers, whatever they may be. It's been fantastic to be involved in this series, and I want to thank everybody who's been involved in bringing this to reality. The Australian College of Applied Psychology, of course, has a Facebook page, and you will find that there is a recording of today's session on that in the next few days, so please do check that out. Thanks again to the panel, and have a lovely day.